So before we start modeling more complex objects and creating more complex geometry, we need to start from a base object. And so we're going to use Polygon primitives. So in order to access this, you can either come to the Poly Modeling tab or menu hotbar here, or you can come to the Create menu and go to Polygon Primitives and select from here. So I'm going to start with a cube, which is probably the most common shape you're going to start from for most of your objects. Okay. And yours might look something like this. You might have a different number of edges going through it. It really depends on what your tool's default is set to. So in order to change, I've created this object and I can just dive in and edit, but sometimes I'll actually want to change some of these attributes that it starts with. So I can find those attributes for this cube creation or whatever primitive I've chosen either down in the channel box. So I can go to the channel box, come down to inputs, and you'll find the name of that type of operation. So this is a polycube. I can click on that and you'll see I can change the different scale proportions of it in the 3 different axes. And I can change how many subdivisions it starts with, right? So I can just come in here, I can set this to 1, 3, 34, whatever you want to do. This is a slight side note, but because I'm not sure if I'm going to cover this in any other video. But in the if you have the channel box selected, you can either click and drag on the actual number area to get like a little slider effect, or you can select this attribute name, and you can come into the viewport and middle mouse click and drag, and that way you can also increase that. I'll also, instead of finding it in the channel box down here, these attributes for the primitive operation, I can come over to Attribute Editor. And it's usually the 3rd tab. So the 1st tab is going to be your transform values for your object. The 2nd tab is going to be the shape node. And the 3rd tab is going to be the operation that was used to create this object, usually these primitives. And so you can see I can find those same options here as well. So I'm going to delete this guy. I'm going to create a different one. So let's go to Polygon Primitives. I'm going to try a cylinder. Okay. So they all have very similar attributes among the different shapes, but with some slight differences depending on the shape, obviously. So I'm going to come over to the attribute editor. Let's go to Poly Cylinder. And you'll see instead of the 3 axes scale, I have a radius, right? And a height. So just 2 different measurements. I have 3 different subdivisions, but they're, again, slightly different. So we have subdivision axis, which is the number of subdivisions for the circular part of the cylinder. Height, which is just going to add me more edges up here. And then this one has subdivisions for the caps themselves, so the top and bottom faces. You'll notice they have these very particular topology, shape, or edge flow to them, this radial pattern, which is important later on. And I can come down to 0 if I just want to have that something that's easily selectable, and maybe I just want to delete that later on. If I come in here and I change the subdivision caps to something higher than 1, and I turn on round cap, you'll see with objects like a cylinder, it's going to give me something like a capsule tip to it. And so anything that is sort of cylindrical in shape will have this option. Let's look at another one. We are going to take a look at the torus. And I'm just going to do this down here instead of coming to the Create tab. So I'm going to click on the torus. So the torus is just a donut. And so this one has a larger radius. And it also has a inner radius or a section radius, which is essentially how thick it is. Right? Some things also have attributes like twist. Let's go ahead and take a look at another one. I'm going to come up to the Create tab, Polygon Primitives, and I'm going to come down to Helix. So you have to try each of these out to kind of get a sense of what types of modifications you can make to it when you first create the object. So I recommend you guys try them all out and just look at what's available. So this is going to be kind of like a spring sort of shape to it. And so I can increase the number of coils to it, right? I can change the radius so it's a little less thick. Similar to the cylinder, I have a cylindrical cap on it, or ends to it, so I can turn on round cap and increase the subdivisions to get like a capsule sort of shape to it. And so that's the gist of using all of these different polygon primitives. The most common ones are going to be right here. You have your sphere, you have your cube, you have your cylinder, you have a cone. Personally, I don't use the cone very often. You have a torus, you have a plane, right? Which is great for starting to model really flat objects or making complex geometry out of flat shapes. I like to kind of start from a plane. And then a disk, which is kind of similar to the plane, but obviously more circular in nature. So that's the basics of the creation tools and creating polygon primitives. And once we start modeling more complex objects with all of our different geometry tools we have, we can get really complex shapes and complex assets from a really primitive starting point. But we always start from a primitive object first.